when you chisel the negative mold away, so here you can see sort of worked my way backwards. Try not to chisel along your surface. Go at a right angle to the surface and then kind of pinch it away. Yeah? You can sort of feel, you need to hit it quite forcefully, hit it, and then you can sort of chip it away. The problem is many students run the chisel this way and you don't know where the chisel is going. So, and then you end up with a huge amount of damage. So you want this to sort of chip away, just like there. Yeah? So you can avoid a lot of damage. So you have to hit quite a bit. And obviously it works well when you have fairly smooth surfaces, yeah? But this is how you chisel it away. And there you can see, yeah, it's sort of chipping away. Because I drive the chisel in this way. Obviously you need to be careful the closer you come, but you always take little chunks away and you work your way backwards, yeah? And sometimes it doesn't work. You swivel, you give your chisel a little bit of a jig, and you can sort of break it away, yeah? So this is a fairly secure way to release your positive cast. Chiseled away, and as you can see, my cast has a few really thin areas here, but that is not so much of a problem because I can actually fill this from inside. So this is all repairable. I've never really sort of freaked out about it. And here it pays off that I actually insulated the negative mold with soap rather than Vaseline, because Vaseline can leave an oily film on it and then it's difficult to add more plaster to it. So if you need to do many repairs or you want to work heavily over a plaster, I recommend a good solid layer of soap rather than Vaseline. Vaseline works if you need sort of like a quick sketch or for a model and stuff like that. So yeah, obviously this mold is suffering from the fact that I had to wait for almost a week to kind of get the clay out and make the cast. That is never good. Try to do it basically all in one day. All the molding should be done in one day, ideally. A quick view how to add plaster to an existing plaster sculpture. So this is totally wet. I just washed it down under the sink. So this is dripping wet. You need to keep the plaster wet. And I'm just filling a few pores and little changes I want to do here. I'm not quite happy with that corner of that mouth. And I actually applied rather generously. And I kind of tap it on like that. So I have to operate the camera with. So I apply it a little bit, yeah, generously, as I said. And when it's at a stage where it has a sort of just on these bigger lumps, I cut it off with a knife, so like a palette knife or a sling. You can just cut it off when it has this sort of thickness or the viscosity of wax. And for these little pores, I mean, I don't want to be more Pope-like than the Pope, so you don't have to fill all of these ones in, but the ones that bother me, I remove, because I think I'm gonna make another negative mold of this. But this will take another few hours to sort of really get the form right, and to have these sort of smooth areas really moving from one area into the next. But sometimes it's actually quite nice to have a bit of structure even on a very smooth surface, because let's say if you want to cast this in bronze, this is also then the area where the patina sort of changes and gets a little bit more more effect to that degree. Okay. So rule number 1, keep it wet. Apply it generously, sand it off the rough bit with the panel knife, and then just continue using it. But the great thing about plaster is you keep it wet all the time. So I always keep it covered with a piece of plastic, because then it's easier to add other plaster. Once it dries up, it's very difficult to successfully add new plaster. So once it's dried up, wet plaster just kind of sticks really quickly onto it and builds not a very good connection with the hole, for example, you want to fill. So this is quite an important, and this is my favorite stage when you actually make sculpture, is working over the plaster, because you can be very, very precise. Plaster is a beautiful material, and many artists use it also as the end product. A lot of artists have started with just making the plaster work, and at some point perhaps you can find a collector who's willing to say, okay, I want to have this in, let's say, in bronze, for example, or in steel, or you get it cast. So because that then is just another level of cost. So for starters and for students and early career artists, I always recommend, if you're working, for example, in generally sculpture, particularly figurative sculpture, plaster is a brilliant way just to kind of continue to make work really cheaply and bring it into a market, for example. As I said, when you have finished the casting process and you chisel it out, this is not where it stops. For me, this is the point where it starts. I left it quite rough, and now perhaps you can zoom in a little bit. So this is the sort of rough surface I got from the casting process, and the modeling tool, I used this sort of sling, and you can also use this with a plaster. But this is now the place where when you have rough pieces to kind of get off, larger parts, I use quite a rough rasp. But traditionally we use these little marble rasps, and you can get them quite cheaply. Also use them in combination with a wire brush. So always keep them clean, because when you go over your cast, they clog up, and you can clean it up. For the work itself, you can go through various stages of working with rasps, and you get it quite fine, and you can even later on, when the plaster dries up, you can use sandpaper. You can basically just kind of work with sandpaper over it, if you really want to have a nice smooth surface, particularly if the work then goes, if you want to have a very smooth surface for a bronze cast, you need to put the hours in the production of the plaster, because the next stage, for example, if you want to cast this in bronze, you would make a silicon mold, and then the silicon mold is covered in wax, which will be the positive for the bronze cast. And the more work you do here, the less you have to do, or the less the foundry has to do later on the bronze. Imagine it is so much easier to work on the plaster and remove grooves and fill holes like this, rather than the bronze foundry filling all those holes with a TIG welder, because that's what they have to do. Or they need to sand it down with heavy machinery. So the more, please spend time on your plasters. If you really want to have a nice smooth finish, you can fill holes, you just add plaster, sand it over, with rasp or sandpaper. And I have studied with artists back when I was studying in Germany. They did a rough sketch, and then they spent months on the plaster. And you can sort of see it, there's a nice energy in good plaster work. When you also look at, for example, valuations, The plasters of, for example, of the very famous artists are now higher priced than their bronzes. This is because the plaster is directly in connection with the artist's hands, whereas the bronze comes out of a foundry process where it's an industrial process where industrial workers, where workers work on these ones and not really the artists. When you go into a foundry, you can basically visit the process and perhaps you can have a choice of how the work is finished in terms of the patina, for example. So this is basically the stage where you can absolutely be very precise and you can absolutely determine how you want your work to be it in this stage or then later on in a casting stage, be it in a, if you make a silicon mold from this, you can go in any direction. You can go concrete cast, you can go aluminium cast, you can go bronze cast, you can even go and make a ceramic from it. Okay, so I will continue to do that, and the next stage then will be early stages of how to make a silicon mold. Okay.